Please, baby girl, Sandra whispered, her voice shaking. Just try. One step. The child's legs trembled, her little hands gripping Sandra's fingers like they were the only thing holding her to the world. And then, for the first time, Whitney moved. No one watching that moment could have known. It wasn't just a baby learning to crawl. It was a family learning to live again. A 2-year-old baby should be crawling, babbling, discovering the world, but Whitney Robinson could barely move. At 50 pounds, she sat on the nursery floor surrounded by untouched toys, crumbs, and crushed cookies. Her tiny hands reached for food she didn't need, her breath shallow from exhaustion. Every night around 3 a.m., her cries echoed to the glass hallways of the Robinson mansion, bouncing off expensive art and empty promises. 10 nannies had already left. The last one didn't even say goodbye, just left a note on the marble counter that read, "I can't do this anymore." That morning, Margaret Robinson stood in front of her vanity mirror, foundation brush trembling in her hand. She looked perfect like a magazine cover, but her eyes were hollow, like the light behind them had burned out. Downstairs, her husband William was already gone, chasing another business deal, another distraction. The mansion sparkled, but no one truly lived inside it. And then Sandra Caldwell arrived. She wasn't hired to save anyone, just to clean. A paycheck to cover rent back in her small Miami apartment. But when she heard that sound, that desperate, hungry sob from a baby too tired to cry anymore, Sandra froze. Something inside her chest pulled tight. She dropped her mop, followed the sound to the stairs, and opened the door no one had dared to touch for weeks. She didn't know it yet, but that single step would change everything. For the baby, for the mother, and for her. Before we go on, let me ask you something. When was the last time you heard someone cry and didn't turn away? If you believe compassion can still change lives, even quiet ones like this, subscribe, because this story might just remind you why love still matters. The Miami sun hadn't yet burned to the morning haze when Sandra stepped off the city bus. Her uniform was pressed, her shoes cheap but spotless, and in her lunch bag she carried a sandwich and a prayer. The mansion's iron gates loomed ahead, beautiful, quiet, and waiting for something to break. A faint sound floated through the still air as she approached the house. Soft at first, then clearer. Crying. It wasn't the sharp wail of a startled baby. It was deeper, almost exhausted, like the sound of someone who had run out of hope but didn't know how to stop. Margaret Robinson met her at the door, her silk robe perfectly tied, her eyes hidden behind dark glasses even though the morning was gray. "You're the new maid?" she asked flatly. "Yes, ma'am. Sandra Caldwell. You'll clean the downstairs. Stay out of the nursery." The words landed heavy, like a rule that mattered more than the others. Sandra nodded, but as Margaret's heels clicked away, the crying upstairs grew louder, steady, heartbreaking. She gripped the mop handle tighter, every instinct in her body screaming to go up those stairs. Finally, she couldn't take it. The door at the end of the hall was half open. Inside, the nursery gleamed like something from a magazine. Stacks of untouched toys lined the walls. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant instead of baby lotion. No laughter, no warmth, just silence and sobs. On the floor sat Whitney Robinson. Her cheeks were blotchy from tears, her shirt damp, her small fingers covered in crumbs. Cookie boxes lay open around her like tiny walls. She wasn't eating anymore. She was just clutching a piece in her hand, as if it were a lifeline. Sandra knelt slowly, her voice gentle. "Hey, sweetheart, you okay?" Whitney blinked up through tears, confused but quiet. The crying softened. "Don't touch her." Sandra turned. Margaret stood in the doorway, face unreadable. "She cries when people interfere," she said coldly. "Just leave her. She'll stop." Then she was gone. Sandra looked back at the baby, the trembling chin, the desperate eyes, and felt something break inside her. That night, when the house was silent again, she slipped back into the nursery. She hummed an ode under her breath and opened her lunch bag. "Let's try something different, baby girl." She offered a spoonful of homemade applesauce. Whitney tasted it, blinked, then reached for more. Her little shoulders relaxed for the first time all day. When you see a child reach for comfort and find none, it makes you wonder how many cries go unheard around us every day. If stories like this move you to notice the quiet pain in others, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Your presence helps keep compassion alive. Sandra smiled faintly as Whitney's eyes fluttered closed in peace. "There you go," she whispered. "You're safe now." By the second week, Sandra had learned the rhythm of the Robinson mansion, or rather, its lack of one. The mornings began with silence, heavy and expectant. Around noon, the faint pop of a wine cork echoed from the kitchen, followed by the soft clink of glass against marble. That was when Margaret Robinson would appear. Her hair was always done, her robe always pressed, her expression distant. She'd scroll through her phone while the TV murmured in the background, articles praising her husband's new real estate venture, glossy magazine posts about the Robinson family, Miami's golden couple. Her fingers lingered over a tabloid headline from 2 years ago. Margaret Robinson glows weeks after giving birth. The picture showed her smiling, slim, flawless. The truth behind that smile was something no one ever wrote about. The sleepless nights, the panic attacks, the bottles of pills lined up on her vanity. Sandra saw it now. The trembling hand, the forced laugh at nothing. Margaret's perfection was armor, and it was cracking. The baby monitor on the counter came to life, Whitney's whimper turning to a cry. Margaret's eyes flicked toward it, then away. "She'll stop," she muttered. Sandra hesitated with her rag halfway across the counter. "Sometimes babies just need to be held, ma'am." Margaret's tone sharpened. "I said she'll stop." The conversation ended there. That afternoon, William Robinson called from his office. Sandra heard his voice carry through the open kitchen door, sharp, businesslike. "No, Margaret, I don't have time for this again. She's fine. The pediatrician said she's within range. Stop dramatizing everything." Sandra paused, her heart tightening as she listened to the sound of Margaret's silence on the other end. Not anger, not even sadness, just nothing. "Look," William continued, lowering his voice. "The gala's in 2 weeks. Please, for once, look like we have our lives together. That's all I'm asking." When the call ended, Margaret poured another glass of wine, staring out the window toward the water that glittered like something she'd never touch again. From the hallway, Sandra caught a glimpse of her standing there, sunlight on her face, expression hollow, like a woman erased from her own story. Later that evening, Whitney's cries filled the nursery again. Sandra stood outside the door, her hands trembling, the echoes slicing through her chest. She looked toward the stairwell where Margaret's shadow flickered and then disappeared. No one was coming. Sandra stepped inside and whispered, "I can't keep pretending I don't hear you, baby girl." She crossed the room, lifted Whitney into her arms, and for the first time, someone stayed. The next morning, the air inside the Robinson mansion felt colder than usual. Margaret stood in the doorway of the kitchen, her coffee cup trembling ever so slightly in her manicured hand. "From now on," she said, her tone clipped, "stay out of the nursery, Sandra. I don't pay you to interfere." Sandra kept her voice calm. "Yes, ma'am." But something in her chest twisted at the word interfere. That child wasn't a project to be managed. She was a little girl trapped in her own silence. As Margaret turned and disappeared up the stairs, Sandra knew she wouldn't keep that promise. Not this one. By noon, Whitney's cries began again. Long, aching sobs that shook through the vents. Sandra tried to keep cleaning, but the sound crawled under her skin. She finally set down her duster, wiped her palms on her apron, and walked quietly to the forbidden door. It opened with a soft creak. The room was the same, bright but lifeless, like a stage no one performed on. Whitney sat in the middle of the floor, red-faced, little fists pounding weakly against the carpet. Sandra knelt down. "Hey there, sugar. It's just me." The baby blinked through tears. Sandra reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a worn picture book, its edges frayed from years of her own daughter's use. "Let's try a story." Her voice was soft at first, uncertain, but the rhythm of the words began to fill the space. Whitney's breathing slowed. She looked at the pictures, then at Sandra, her expression curious. When Sandra began to hum, a lullaby her mother used to sing on long Atlanta nights, Whitney's mouth twitched. It wasn't a cry this time. It was a sound, a tiny breathy giggle, fragile as glass. Sandra froze, eyes stinging. "You like that one, huh?" she whispered, smiling. Whitney clapped her little hands together, a noise that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. In the hallway, a shadow moved. Margaret stood there unseen. For a heartbeat, something alive flickered across her face, something like longing, but then she turned away. Her footsteps faded down the hall. Sandra stayed with Whitney until the baby's eyes grew heavy. She stretched her legs gently, massaging them the way the doctor had shown on a pamphlet left in the kitchen drawer. Then she laid her down and brushed a hand over her hair. Leaning close, Sandra whispered, "I won't quit like the others, baby girl. I promise you that." Whitney sighed in her sleep, one chubby hand curling around Sandra's finger, as if she believed her. The pediatric clinic in Coral Gables smelled like disinfectant and paper gowns. Whitney sat on the exam table in a soft pink onesie, her cheeks flushed, her legs dangling and motionless. Sandra stood beside her, holding her tiny hand while Margaret scrolled through her phone, pretending not to hear the nurse whisper about the baby's weight. When Dr. Klein entered, his smile faded almost immediately. He flipped through the chart, his brow tightening. "Mrs. Robinson, your daughter's BMI is dangerously high for her age. Her joints and heart are under strain. If she doesn't begin movement therapy immediately, the long-term effects could be serious, possibly permanent." Margaret's phone slipped from her hand, clattering onto the tile. "Permanent?" Dr. Klein nodded. "We're not talking about baby fat anymore. This is physical and emotional stagnation. She needs consistent human interaction, guided movement, affection every day." Sandra felt the words like a punch. She looked down at Whitney, who stared at the ceiling light, humming softly to herself. Margaret pressed her trembling hands to her face. I don't even know how to hold her anymore," she whispered, voice cracking. "Every time I try, she cries. And I panic. I freeze." The doctor hesitated, then quietly stepped out, giving them space. The room fell still except for the soft buzz of the fluorescent light. Sandra took a step closer. "Ma'am," she said gently, "you don't have to know everything today. You just have to start." Margaret looked up, her mascara streaked. "I don't think she wants me." Sandra shook her head. "Oh, she does. She just forgot what love feels like. That's not her fault, and it's not yours either." Margaret's gaze shifted to Whitney, who was now fidgeting with the stethoscope left on the table. Sandra lifted the baby carefully, placing her into her mother's arms. For a moment, Margaret froze. Then Whitney's hand brushed against her cheek. The child didn't cry this time. She just sighed, resting her head against her mother's shoulder. Tears rolled freely down Margaret's face. "I thought I'd lost her," she whispered. Sandra reached out, one hand steadying them both. "You didn't lose her, ma'am. You just needed someone to show you the way back. If you've ever watched someone hit rock bottom and wish you could lift them up, remember, kindness shared keeps hope breathing." Follow stories like this one, because they remind us that even broken hearts can learn to hold again. The nurse peeked in, startled to see the three of them together, mother, child, and maid, bound not by duty, but by something far more human, a second chance. The first clue came by accident. Sandra was dusting the side table in William Robinson's office when she noticed a slip of paper wedged between two business magazines. It was a receipt, the Langford Hotel, Brickell, dated 3 nights ago. Handwritten on the back, in bold slanted ink, was a single word, Vanessa, and next to it, a drawn heart. Sandra froze, the air in her chest turning sharp. She didn't mean to pry. She never did. But the name felt heavy in her palm, like a secret she wasn't supposed to carry. She folded it quickly, slipping it into her apron pocket. That evening, the house came alive in its usual hollow way. William's car pulled into the driveway right before sunset. The sound of polished shoes against tile echoed through the hall. He looked immaculate. Tailored suit, perfect tie, the kind of man who'd never allow a wrinkle, not even in his lies. "Evening, ladies," he said smoothly, dropping his keys on the counter. He kissed Margaret on the cheek, without really touching her. You look tired. Rough day. I took Whitney to the doctor, she said, voice fragile but steady. They said her health is at risk. She needs therapy, William. We need to do this together. He sighed, loosening his cufflinks like the conversation was an inconvenience. Maggie, don't start this again. You worry too much. It's bad for your image and mine. Her lips trembled. Our daughter's sick, and you're worried about your image? He smiled, a tight, condescending curve. You're overreacting, as usual. You've been off lately. Maybe talk to your therapist about these mood swings. The word unstable hung unspoken, but it filled the room like smoke. Sandra stood at the kitchen doorway, pretending to wipe the counter, watching the scene unravel. Margaret's shoulders stiffened, her eyes glistening with humiliation. William picked up his phone mid-conversation, scrolling as if she wasn't even there. Margaret whispered, You don't even see us anymore. He didn't look up. Don't make a scene. Sandra's hand clenched around the rag until her knuckles turned white. Margaret wasn't just breaking. She was vanishing. And for the first time, Sandra saw real fear in her eyes. Not fear of losing her husband, but fear of losing her child in a world where no one seemed to care. That night, the thunder rolled in from Bay. Rain lashed against the windows as Sandra scrubbed the floors long after midnight, the storm outside echoing the one that had begun inside the house. In her apron pocket, the folded receipt felt like a ticking clock. Something was coming, and it wouldn't stay hidden for long. The storm came fast, rolling off the Atlantic with a growl that shook the palms outside the Robinson mansion. By nightfall, thunder cracked so loud the glass trembled in its frames. Sandra was in the kitchen washing bottles when the lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. Power's out, she called, but her voice was swallowed by the wind rattling the shutters. Upstairs, Whitney whimpered. Margaret's footsteps echoed down the stairs, her phone flashlight slicing through the dark. She hates storms, she said, her voice tight. I'll go check on her. Sandra followed close behind, every instinct alert. The air smelled like rain and fear. When they reached the nursery, the room was empty. The crib was open, the blanket tossed aside. Whitney? Margaret's voice broke. Then they heard it, a soft thump, followed by a tiny cry. From the kitchen below, Margaret ran first, barefoot, her robe whipping behind her. The emergency lights from the street cast thin blue beams across the tiles. And there, near the counter, sat Whitney, her little legs sprawled, a toppled sippy cup beside her. Her lip quivered as she tried to pull herself up again. Margaret dropped to her knees, panic flooding her voice. Oh my God! Baby, no. Are you hurt? Sandra knelt beside her, her hands steadying both of them. She's okay, she said gently. She's scared, that's all. Margaret's sobs came fast, sharp, uncontrollable. She fell because I wasn't watching. Because I... Sandra gripped her shoulders. No, listen to me. Her voice cut through the storm. She fell because she's trying. That means she's alive again. For a long second, all that could be heard was the storm's roar and Whitney's uneven breathing. Then the little girl looked up, eyes shining in the dim light, and pushed against the tile with trembling arms. Her knees wobbled, her palms slid. But she didn't stop. Inch by inch, she crawled forward, one hand, one knee, then the other, toward her mother's sobbing frame. Margaret covered her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. She's moving, she whispered. Lightning flashed through the window, bright and blinding, freezing the moment in silver light. Mother and child, reaching for each other across the floor. Whitney reached Margaret's knees, pressing her tiny face into the folds of her robe. Margaret wrapped her arms around her, shaking. Sandra exhaled, relief washing over her like the rain outside. For the first time in that mansion's long silence, love had made a sound louder than thunder. The morning after the storm, the mansion felt different. Air thick with the scent of wet earth and something unspoken. Light filtered weakly through the curtains, tracing silver lines across the marble floor, where Whitney had crawled just hours before. Sandra brewed coffee in the quiet kitchen, her hand still trembling with the memory of thunder and tears. Then came the sound, the heavy slam of the front door. "Margaret." William's voice cut through the stillness like a blade. "What the hell happened here?" He strode into the foyer, suit immaculate, eyes cold. The moment his gaze swept over the toys scattered across the floor, the damp towel by the counter, and Whitney's half-finished bottle, his jaw tightened. "This place looks like a daycare," he snapped. "Do you have any idea how much money you've been wasting lately? Therapy bills, doctor appointments, this chaos?" He turned on Sandra. "And why is she still here? I told you to keep the staff rotation clean. Fire her." Margaret stood at the base of the staircase, robe cinched tight, a calm steadiness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "If she leaves," she said softly, "Whitney and I leave too." William froze. "What did you just say?" Margaret took a step forward. "I'm done pretending everything's fine. Sandra stays. My daughter needs her. I need her." His face darkened. "Don't test me, Margaret. You think you can raise that child alone? You can't even manage yourself without a bottle of wine." The insult hung heavy between them. Whitney whimpered in the living room, sensing the tension. Margaret's voice shook, but she didn't back down. "You want to talk about control? About appearances? Fine." She took a deep breath, tears welling but unshed. "You can have your image, William. The galas, the headlines, the perfect facade. But I'm keeping my child." He stepped closer, anger crackling like static. "You'll regret this." "No," she whispered. "For the first time, I won't." For a heartbeat, the world held still. Then William turned sharply, his footsteps echoing through the hall as he stormed out, the door slamming like a final gavel. Silence flooded the mansion again, but it wasn't the hollow kind anymore. It was the sound of something ending so that something else could begin. Margaret sank to her knees, shoulders shaking, and Sandra was there in an instant, arms wrapping around her. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. In that fragile morning light, a new kind of family was born. Not from blood or vows, but from the choice to stay when everything else fell apart. Spring came quietly to the Robinson mansion, soft and forgiving. The gardens that once stood choked with neglect now bloomed with color. Lavender spilling over the walkway, sunlight glinting through freshly washed windows. Inside, the air was different too. Laughter, small, honest laughter, drifted to the halls like music that had been waiting years to be played. Whitney giggled from the playmat in the living room, clapping her hands as Sandra stacked bright wooden blocks into a teetering tower. Margaret sat nearby, her notebook open on her lap, a half-finished letter to her therapist resting between gentle fingers. Every Tuesday, she attended her support group downtown, where women spoke of silence and shame and how to find their way back. Margaret always listened. Now she also spoke. William had moved out 2 months ago. The tabloids had their headlines. Socialite split, mansion of tears. But the house itself seemed lighter without a shadow. There were no more slammed doors, no cold breakfast left untouched. Just a simple rhythm of mornings filled with oatmeal, nursery rhymes, and Whitney's bright laughter echoing off the marble. Sandra often found herself pausing mid-task, folding laundry, watering plants, just to listen, to breathe, to realize that healing wasn't something grand or dramatic. It was Margaret kneeling on the rug, clumsy but patient, helping her daughter stand. It was Whitney's chubby fingers gripping hers. It was the sound of a home learning to be warm again. "Okay, sweetheart," Margaret murmured one morning, kneeling before Whitney, who stood wobbling between her and Sandra. "You can do it. Just one step." The baby tottered forward, arms outstretched, face lit with determination. One step, then another. Her balance faltered, but Sandra's hand was there, steady and sure, guiding her gently toward her mother's waiting arms. When Whitney reached her, she let out a tiny squeal, a sound so pure it broke something open inside them both. Margaret lifted her close, laughing through tears. "She's walking," she whispered. "My baby's walking." Then Whitney looked between them, her two worlds, her two anchors, and said softly, "Mama." The word lingered, trembling in the air like the end of a prayer. Margaret pressed her forehead to Whitney's. Sandra's eyes shone. In that moment, the mansion wasn't haunted anymore. It was alive. With laughter, with second chances, with a quiet power of love that refused to quit. Some stories remind us that real change begins in the quiet moments, when someone refuses to walk away. If you believe love still has the power to rebuild what's broken, tell me your thoughts in the comments, because choosing to keep listening is how hope keeps walking.